She was refilling wine glasses when I walked through the door. Not as a guest. As the help. My sister Sophie had her hair pulled back tight, wearing an apron over what looked like clothes she had slept in. She moved quietly around the long dining table, eyes cast down, not making contact with anyone. Her husband's mother sat at the head of the table, laughing loudly at something a man in a blazer said. My brother-in-law Derek was there too, relaxed, one arm draped over his chair like he owned the air in the room. He probably thought he did. I had driven 4 hours from Philadelphia. Sophie had stopped answering my calls 3 weeks ago. Before that, she'd been returning texts with 1 or 2 words, always something like, "I'm fine" or "busy lately," with no punctuation, no emoji, nothing that sounded like her. Sophie used to send me voice memos. She'd ramble for 6 minutes about a book she was reading or a recipe she'd tried. Then one day that stopped and I told myself it was just life. Adult life. I was busy too, but something in my stomach hadn't let it go. I reached out to her college roommate, who said she hadn't heard from Sophie in months. I called our cousin Marcus, who said the last time he saw her she looked tired, like a different person. That was the word he used. Different. So I drove. Derek's mother. I'll call her Margaret. Because that's her name and she deserves no softer title. Margaret glanced up when I stepped into the foyer. Her expression didn't change. She had the practiced stillness of someone who had spent decades performing calm while sharpening knives. "You must be Sophie's brother," she said, not standing up. Sophie turned from the sideboard. The moment she saw me, something in her face broke open and then closed again just as fast, like a window slamming shut in a storm. She looked at me and I could see she was terrified. Not of me. Of what my being there might cost her. "Ryan." Her voice was barely audible. "You didn't say you were coming?" "I didn't know I needed an appointment to see my sister," I said. Derek set down his glass. "This isn't really a good time, man. We've got guests." I looked around the table. 8 people. None of whom I recognized. Business contacts, maybe. The kind of dinner party where everything is performance and nothing is real. "Sophie," I said, "put the bottle down." She hesitated. Her hands were shaking slightly. "She's fine," Margaret said coolly. "She likes to help." "Don't you, Sophie?" And there it was. Not a question. A command dressed as a question, spoken in the voice of someone who had given that command 100 times and never once been refused. Sophie set the bottle down. I walked to her, stood beside her, and said quietly, "Are you okay?" She nodded. A mechanical nod. The kind that means the opposite. One of the guests, a man with silver cufflinks, chuckled softly and leaned toward the woman beside him. I caught the words, "sensitive family," before he turned back to his plate. I stayed for dinner. I sat down without being invited and I didn't move. Derek was rigid with something between anger and calculation, trying to decide whether a scene would make things worse. Margaret watched me with flat, polite hostility. Sophie sat at the far end of the table and barely ate. I watched everything. After the guests left, Derek pulled me aside near the front hall. He was the kind of man who became very reasonable the moment he was cornered, the kind who smiled while saying things that weren't friendly at all. "Look," he said, "I know you're close with your sister. That's great. But Sophie has been going through some things emotionally, and what she needs right now is stability, not disruption." "What kind of things?" I said. "Just she gets overwhelmed. She has a hard time managing the household sometimes, and Margaret has been helping her get on a schedule. It's been working." "A schedule?" I repeated. "It helps her," he said, with the patient tone of a man explaining something obvious to someone slow. "She's doing better." I looked at him for a long moment. I didn't say anything else. I just nodded like I understood and told him I'd let myself out. In the driveway, I sat in my car for 20 minutes. I thought about every phone call Sophie hadn't made. Every text that came back in 2 words. I thought about the way she'd looked at me when I walked in, that flash of hope, and then the way she buried it, trained it down like a plant that had been punished every time it reached for the light. I drove to the nearest hotel. I wasn't going home. That night I sent Sophie a message. Just one line. "I know something is wrong. You don't have to say anything. I'm not going anywhere." She didn't respond. But she read it. I could see the timestamp. The next morning I called our dad. He lives in Arizona now, retired, spends his mornings fishing and his evenings watching baseball. He is the calmest man I have ever known. The kind of calm that isn't absence of feeling but something more deliberate. He listened to everything I told him without interrupting. Then he said, "Tell me what you need." "I need to know what's been going on for the last year," I said. "I need to understand what we're dealing with before I do anything that makes it harder for her to get out." He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "You think it's that bad?" It wasn't a question. I think it's exactly that bad, I said. I spent the next week in Connecticut. I didn't go back to the house. I rented a small Airbnb and I started paying attention. I drove past the house at different hours, not creepily, just noting what I could. Sophie's car was always there. She didn't seem to go anywhere alone. Twice I saw Derek leave in the morning and Margaret arrive an hour later. She stayed for most of the day. I reached out to one of Sophie's friends from before the marriage, a woman named Dana who I remembered from holidays. Dana answered on the first ring like she'd been waiting. "I've been worried sick," she said. "I tried to visit 6 months ago and Derek told me Sophie wasn't feeling well. I texted her and she said she'd call me back. She never did. I stopped reaching out because I didn't want to make things worse for her." "Did she ever say anything to you before the marriage? About Derek or his family?" Dana paused. "She said Margaret was a lot. She said Derek really needed his mother's approval for everything. But she loved him. She thought it would get better once they settled in. That was the thing about this kind. They never arrived all at once. They arrived one small compromise at a time, until one day the person you knew had been replaced by someone quieter, someone who had learned that being smaller was safer. I hired a private investigator. Not to dig up drama. To build a picture. What he found over the next 10 days was more than I expected. Derek's business was co-signed on Margaret's assets. Every major financial decision in their household went through her. Sophie's name was on the joint account, but she had no access to the card. There had been a complaint filed by a former employee at Derek's company, a woman that had been quietly settled. And 3 years ago, before Sophie, Derek had been briefly engaged to someone else. That woman had moved to Oregon and, according to her public social media, no longer spoke about that period of her life at all. I also found the texts. Sophie had left herself logged into an old email address on a shared tablet, a tablet I knew about because I'd helped her set it up 2 Christmases ago. I didn't go looking for them, but when I opened the account to see if she'd used it recently, her drafts folder had 17 unsent messages. All to me. All written in the middle of the night. The earliest one was from 14 months ago. "I don't know how to say this. Margaret tells me I'm ungrateful. Derek says I embarrass him when I talk to my family. I've been trying to do better, but I don't know what better means anymore. I think something is wrong with me." The most recent was from 6 weeks ago. "I wanted to call you today." I picked up my phone and I put it down because Derek checks my call log, and last time I called you, he didn't speak to me for 4 days. "I'm sorry. I don't know who I am anymore." I sat in that Airbnb and I read every single one. All 17. Then I sat very still for a long time and I decided what I was going to do, and I decided how I was going to do it, and I made myself breathe through it instead of driving straight to their house. Because that would only hurt Sophie. So I made calls instead. A family law attorney. A domestic abuse advocate through a local nonprofit. A therapist who specialized in coercive control. A term I had to look up and then couldn't stop reading about, because it described exactly what I was seeing with a precision that made me feel sick with recognition. The advocate told me something I kept coming back to. She said that in these situations, the most dangerous moment for the victim is often when the controlling partner feels like they're losing control. She said any intervention had to be done carefully. With a safety plan, not just emotionally. I took that seriously. 2 weeks after my first visit, I texted Sophie again. A different kind of message this time. I told her I had found the email drafts. I told her I was not angry. I told her I had been talking to people who could help. I told her she didn't have to do anything yet, but I needed her to know that there was a door open whenever she was ready to walk through it. She read it. Didn't respond. 3 hours later, she called me from a gas station. She only had a few minutes, she said. She'd told Derek she was getting a car wash. Her voice was so flat and careful it broke something in me. She sounded like someone reading from a script, choosing every word for minimum danger. "I don't know if I can leave," she said. "You don't have to know that yet," I said. "He'll fight me on everything. The house, the money, Margaret will she'll make it a whole thing. She has lawyers." "So do we," I said. Silence. "Ryan, I'm scared." "I know," I said. "I'm handling it. You don't have to be brave right now. You just have to stay safe and let me work." She hung up when a car pulled in beside her. But before she did, she said something I have replayed 100 times. She said, "I knew you'd come." I had my attorney reach out the following week. Not to Derek, not yet. To Sophie first, with a full explanation of her options, her rights, what a legal separation would look like, what she was entitled to from the joint account and the marital property. The attorney was a woman named Carol who had been doing family law for 22 years and who had the energy of someone who genuinely enjoyed dismantling the financial hiding games of people like Derek. Carol explained to Sophie, clearly and slowly, that the fact that her name wasn't on the card didn't mean she had no claim to the account. It meant Derek had structured it that way, possibly on purpose, possibly to maintain control, and a judge would find that very interesting. She also explained what coercive control was and that in their state it had recently been recognized as a form of domestic abuse under the law. Something in Sophie shifted after that conversation. Carol told me afterward that Sophie had been almost inaudible for the first 20 minutes and then something changed and she started asking very sharp, specific questions about asset documentation. She's smarter than he thinks she is, Carol said. I know, I said. Sophie started documenting things on her own. Small things at first, receipts she photographed, dates and times she noted in a journal she kept under the floorboard of her closet. She said she'd seen someone do that in a movie years ago and never thought she'd need to. She texted me in short bursts from a secondary phone number I'd set up for her on a prepaid short, factual entries. He told his mother I had a breakdown. I didn't. I disagreed with her about the grocery order. Margaret came over unannounced again. She went through my phone while I was cooking. Derek watched and said nothing. He told me if I contact a lawyer he'll make sure everyone knows I'm unstable. Those were his exact words. That last one. I made sure to save it. When Sophie finally left, it was a Tuesday morning in March. Derek was at a work conference in Boston. Margaret had no reason to come by. Sophie packed 2 bags, the documents Carol told her to gather, the journal, the prepaid phone, and she drove to my dad's friend's house 3 towns over a woman neither Derek nor Margaret had any connection to, whose name didn't appear anywhere in Sophie's life they could trace. Sophie called me from that house at 11 in the morning. She sounded like she hadn't slept in days, which she probably hadn't. I did it, she said. I know, I said. I'm on my way. When I got there, she was sitting at the kitchen table drinking tea, both hands wrapped around the mug. She looked small and exhausted and also somehow more present than she had in years, like something behind her eyes had turned back on. She didn't cry for a long time. Then she did, quietly, into my shoulder, for about 10 minutes. Then she pulled back and said, "Tell me what happens now." I told her. Carol filed within the week. Derek's response was exactly what we expected. His lawyer opened with the word unstable in the second sentence, questioned Sophie's mental health history, suggested she had fabricated events for financial gain. Margaret gave a formal statement characterizing Sophie as difficult, emotionally volatile, and prone to misremembering things. We had the texts. We had the journal. We had Sophie's email drafts, time-stamped over 14 months. We had the former employee's settlement record, not the details, but the existence of it, which Carol used carefully. We had a therapist assessment confirming clinical signs of long-term psychological coercion. We had the pattern of a man who had done something like this before. Derek's lawyer got quieter as each document crossed the table. What broke him, though, wasn't the legal case. It was what happened at his company. Derek had spent years building a very specific image. He spoke at events. He had a newsletter about leadership and integrity. He posted on LinkedIn with the frequency and sobriety of someone who had decided their personal brand was their most valuable asset. Sophie had connections he'd forgotten about. People from her previous life, before the marriage, who remembered her as sharp and capable and real. Some of them worked in industries adjacent to Derek's. When the story started to leak carefully, through the right channels, not as gossip but as documented fact, people who had once respected Derek's brand started asking questions. A woman he had mentored reached out to me directly. She said she had noticed things at events over the years, the way he spoke over Sophie, the way Margaret would correct her in public, but she had told herself it wasn't her business. It became my business, she said. The moment I understood what it actually was. She wrote a piece. Not a hit piece, a measured, well-sourced account of coercive control in professional circles, how it hides in plain sight, how the social capital of a man like Derek functions as a shield. She didn't use his name. She used enough detail that people in their circle recognized it immediately. His LinkedIn engagement dried up overnight. 2 board members of a nonprofit he sat on quietly asked him to step back. He had no board now. He had the image, but the image had cracked and underneath it was just a man who had spent years making his wife into a ghost and calling it marriage. The divorce settlement took 4 months to finalize. Sophie walked away with the house, which she promptly sold, half the joint assets, and alimony structured over 3 years, enough time for her to rebuild, for her to finish the certification program she'd put on hold 2 years into the marriage because Derek thought it was a distraction. Carol called me after the final signing. "Tell your sister," she said, "that she was the most prepared client I've had in 20 years. She documented everything exactly right." Sophie heard that and smiled. Actually smiled. Not the careful, managed smile she'd worn at that dinner party when I walked through the door. Something real. something that reached her eyes. The recovery was not a straight line. I want to say that clearly because the story doesn't end at the courthouse and anyone who pretends otherwise isn't being honest. There were weeks where Sophie slept 12 hours and still felt like she hadn't rested. There were days she questioned herself, replayed things, wondered if she'd been too dramatic, too sensitive, too much. She had a therapist she saw twice a week for the first 3 months. She told me once that the hardest thing wasn't the anger she expected, the anger it was learning how to want things again. Small things. What do I want for dinner? What do I want to do on Saturday? Questions that had been answered for her for so long that her own preferences had gone quiet. She moved to a new city. Not to run away. Just because she wanted a new start that was entirely her own choosing, which felt important. She got a job she liked. She started rock climbing, which seemed completely random until she explained it to me. She said it was the first physical thing she'd ever done where the only person responsible for whether she made it to the top was herself. No one could make that choice for her. No one could undermine her grip. I visited her 6 months after the move. She had a small apartment with a lot of light, plants on every windowsill, a bookshelf that was already overflowing. We went to dinner at a place she picked, and she ordered exactly what she wanted without scanning the table first to see what anyone else was getting. After dinner, we walked along the waterfront and she said, "I keep waiting to feel guilty. For leaving? For not leaving sooner," she said. "For not seeing it sooner." "You saw it," I said. "You wrote 17 letters about it. You just didn't know yet that seeing it was enough. That you didn't need their permission to trust what you saw." She thought about that for a while. "I keep thinking about other women," she said, "who are still in it. Who don't have a brother who shows up." I knew where that was going. I had expected it. Actually, because that's who Sophie is. She had already been in contact with the domestic abuse nonprofit that had helped us in the early stages. She had already started volunteering on their crisis text line on Thursday evenings. She told me she was thinking about pursuing a certification in advocacy work, something that would let her do it more formally. "You already know more about coercive control than most people who've never lived it," I said. "That's the point," she said. We stood there watching the water for a while. The city was quiet that night. Somewhere behind us, a restaurant was still open, voices carrying out through an open door, the sound of ordinary Thursday evening life. "I want to say something," Sophie said. I waited. "I know you moved things around at work. I know you spent money. I know you drove up there on a feeling because I'd gone quiet and you didn't let yourself explain it away." "Sophie, let me finish," she said. "I want you to know that I knew, somewhere in me, that if I got small enough, eventually you'd notice. That sounds terrible. But I think part of me was counting on it. Because I couldn't do it myself yet. And you didn't make me feel stupid for that. You handled it. You let me take the steps I needed to take and you built the floor under them. I didn't say anything for a second. You would have gotten out," I said. "On your own timeline." "Maybe," she said. "But I don't know that. And I don't have to know it. Because you showed up." We walked back through the city, and she talked about her job and a book she was reading and a hiking trip she was planning in the fall. Normal things. Ordinary things. The kind of conversation we hadn't had in years. Margaret, for what it's worth, attempted a counter-strategy. She had her own attorney send a letter implying Sophie had defamed her and Derek by allowing information about the settlement to become public. Carol responded with 4 sentences and a document attachment. We never heard from Margaret's attorney again. Derek tried to re-enter professional life after a few months. He pivoted his brand, dropped the leadership content, started posting about personal growth and lessons learned, which is what men like him do. He got some traction. People have short memories and platforms don't check receipts. I'm not going to pretend he faced consequences proportional to what he did. That's not how this world works and I'm not interested in lying about it. But Sophie is building something real. She is doing it with her own name, her own choices, her own timeline. And the people in her life, the ones who stayed, the ones she's found since they know who she actually is. Not the version Derek needed her to be. The actual her, which turns out to be a lot more than he ever gave her credit for. Last month she sent me a voice memo. 6 minutes long. She was talking about a book she'd finished and a class she was taking and a conversation she'd had with someone on the crisis line that had stayed with her. She sounded like herself. She sounded like the person I remembered before all of it, except steadier. Quieter in the good way. Present. I listened to it twice. Then I texted her back and said it was good to hear her voice. She sent back a string of emojis and a photo of her plants, which apparently now take up an entire shelf. That's what I think about when I think about how this ended. Not the courtroom, not the documents. Not Derek's face when the settlement terms were read out loud. I think about that voice memo. 6 minutes, just my sister talking. Unguarded, filling in the silence she'd been living in for too long. That was the whole thing. That was everything.